recently had an experience I'd like to share here. For the past 2 years, I have worked for a service that places house sitters with clients in need of such people. Besides having to sit in one or two dirty homes, my job has been without note. There would be no indication that this following position would be any different. I arrived just before 7 a.m. as I was instructed. My clients were on their way out. They were a young couple with one child heading on their first family getaway since the pandemic began. The father left me with a few last instructions and they were on their way. The house itself was a nice 2-story structure you often see in more affluent areas of the country. Not my most posh assignment by far, but very comfortable nonetheless. I unpacked my things in the guest bedroom and made myself familiar with the home's layouts. From the look of things, my stay would be a quiet one. I expected to spend my times as I usually do, watching a film or two on streaming services or catching up on my YouTube subscriptions. For the first 3 days, everything played out as I had planned. It would be the fourth, which I'd be tested in a way I never thought possible. When I rose from bed that Sunday, the sun was just beginning to peek over the trees. I prefer to awake early when I am working just in case someone is scheduled to drop by. My livelihood relies on my good reputation. I never want to endanger that, and people do talk after all. Just after 7, I sat down to do some paperwork and heard a knock at the door. I answered, and a tall, muscular, older man introduced himself as Chris. He was the neighbor directly across the street. He proceeded to warn me about a recent string of home invasions happening in the city. Although there had been no indication these criminals had designs on the specific neighborhood, he felt it was necessary to let me know this. I assumed to keep my eyes open and stay safe, and we spoke a further few minutes before he said goodbye and I returned to my work. This news was somewhat concerning, but I felt safe. The family surely would have warned me. I assumed that Christopher was being overcautious and tried to put it out of my mind. The remainder of my afternoon was wasted in front of the television, a pastime I seem to enjoy more and more as I age. At around 5 p.m., I decided it may be time to make dinner. There were several large frozen meals available, so I heated one in the microwave. Just as I was sitting down to eat, a knocking came at the door. For the second time, Chris was there to warn me. Only this time, he insisted he had noticed an SUV with dark-tinted windows driving around. They had passed down the street several times. I was kind and didn't laugh in his face, but I wanted to. I thanked him and we went our separate ways once again. I now knew who he was. Most neighbors had that retired person that stares out their windows all day, waiting for the smallest thing to happen. And this must have been Christopher. Despite his entertaining behavior, his repeated interruptions were becoming a bother to me, I thought. And I was fortunate enough to avoid any further interactions with him for the remainder of the day. I slept and rose again just before dawn. I expected Chris would arrive soon, but I was able to enjoy my morning meal and paperwork without any further annoyances. Things were pleasantly quiet, and as I sat down to watch a film, I was beginning to believe that I may have the day to myself. Unfortunately, it was not to be. I had fallen asleep, and just after 2 p.m., a ringing of the doorbell shocked me from my sleep. I expected it to be Chris. However, as I peeked through the small window, I saw someone else, another man. He was well dressed, and I assumed was another neighbor. I put on my kindest smile and greeted this random stranger with a good morning. He looked a little confused but quickly regained his composure and asked for the homeowners. I informed him that they were out of town at the moment and told him when they would be expected back. And he just thanked me and smiled. Something about his smile was unsettling. I was unable to end the conversation before the man rushed toward the door. Out of nowhere, another man appeared and joined him. I tried to close the door, but the might of them together was too much for me. I was unsure what they wanted, but I was positive I needed to call for help as soon as possible. With no other option, I relinquished my hold on the door and ran. The men spilled in behind me. I had no immediate plan, but I noticed the stairs and sprinted up to the second floor. I just needed enough time alone to dial 911. Thankfully, I got it when I jumped into a hallway bathroom. The 2 men were close behind me, and fortunately, I was able to get the door closed and locked before they could reach me. I pulled my phone from my back pocket and dialed as quickly as possible. I could feel the men's bodies banging against the door as I leaned on it. The operator answered, and I gasped out my trouble between heaving breaths, and not long after, the banging stopped. A loud yelling and rumbling replaced it. Then I heard what sounded like a group of people running down the stairs. Everything went silent after that. The operator continued to talk. I put my ear to the door, and there was nothing for almost a minute. Then a faint voice said my name. It was weak at first. I almost thought it was my imagination, but then it came again. It was now much stronger and closer, and I realized it was Christopher. I meekly answered. I was still unsure of what was happening. "The men are gone. I got a piece of one of them, but I guess they didn't want no more." I did consider that this may be a trap, but I took a chance and opened the door. Standing in the hall was Chris with a bleeding cut above his right eye. He had a big grin across his face, and I got the impression he'd enjoyed his brief fight with the home invaders. We exchanged "are you okays," and I thanked him for arriving when he did, and I meant it this time. We met the police at the door and filled them in on what had happened. The paramedics fussed over Chris's cut, but he refused care, and we spent an hour giving statements. When all was said and done, I had to admit I owed Christopher a lot, perhaps even my life. It seems like he was just happy to be right. Once the officers had gone, he wished me luck and returned home. It wouldn't be until I was alone that the seriousness of it all hit me. I spent the evening curled up in a ball on the couch and stayed there until the following morning. I was still quite shaken up, but I was alive. Christopher and I would never speak again. Other than a smile and a wave when I visited the mailbox, life had returned to normal. I didn't want to ruin my client's vacation, so I waited until they returned and notified them of the attempted robbery. They were naturally horrified and even offered me more money. I, of course, refused. I did make sure to let them know that they had an amazing neighbor. And to my shock, they mentioned they had only spoken to him once in the 5 years they had lived there. This made our interactions over the last week seem even more special. I sometimes wonder if Christopher had been put in place to keep me safe, maybe like a guardian angel. I'm well aware of how foolish this sounds, but I believe it nonetheless. I'm pleased to say none of the other jobs have been quite as exciting as this was, and I have yet to meet another man as kind and selfless as Christopher. If you happen to be reading this, kind sir, I know no amount of thanks can ever equal your actions. On that day, you saved another man's life, a complete stranger. Somewhere out there in the world, a man lives happy today because of your selfless act. May your life be long and happy, and may your family remember you forever. I had an exceptionally upsetting incident on my third job house sitting. To help you understand why it affected me so much, I should probably tell you about myself. I grew up in a single-parent home. My mom has always been a loving and understanding parent, but I think she felt pressure to find a new husband. My dad left us soon after I was born. She began dating almost immediately. This pressure caused her to make a lot of bad choices. She did the bar scene, constantly bringing home a new man. A few would stay, but not for long. She never seemed to understand that you don't find a husband in a place like that. Every relationship inevitably broke down into arguments and fighting, and on more than one occasion, the fights got physical on both sides. My mom's love of wine did a lot to inflame tensions. And because of this constant state of chaos, I became a people pleaser and hated confrontation. It's the big reason behind my panic attacks. I've worked a lot on my assertiveness, but I sometimes fall back into my old habits. My story starts in 2015. I was bouncing from job to job. I've been having a hard time finding something in my degree field. A friend had recently become a house sitter and made it sound fun. She made it sound like a permanent vacation, and I desperately needed one of those. She gave me a quick course on the ins and outs of the job and helped me land my first client. I was a ball of nerves, but I got through it. The second client went much smoother. It would be the third that would make me think twice about doing this long term. It was now mid-2016. I answered an ad asking for someone to sit a house a few hours away. This would be my first long-distance gig, and I didn't want to mess it up. I made a list of questions and showed them to my friend. She suggested a few changes, and I called the number. The homeowner and I made an appointment for me to view the property. I quickly made arrangements and drove up to meet him. He was a businessman, needing to leave town on short notice. My job would be to accept packages and mail, but most importantly, look after his dog. The dog's name was Bart. He was a St. Bernard mix, and when we first met, he didn't appear very interested in anything. He sniffed me once and returned to his bed. It all seemed simple enough. I asked a few questions, and at the end of the appointment, we both decided that I'd be perfect for the job. I checked into my hotel for the night and returned the following morning. My stay would be for 3 full nights, and I was looking forward to relaxing and maybe even playing with Bart. That afternoon, I tried to do just that. Bart wasn't interested, though. Instead, we lounged together on the patio. It was a beautiful sunny day. The slow, cool breeze in the shade made it feel like paradise. The home's slightly remote location allowed for a wonderfully peaceful environment. I felt calmer than I had in a very long time. Bart and I took a brief nap before going back inside for dinner. I ordered a pizza and cheesy bread. Afterwards, I opened a pint of ice cream I bought for such an occasion and parked my butt in front of the television. Bart was proving to be just as easy to handle as I'd hoped. He joined me on the couch and we watched a movie on Netflix. We had completed a little less than half of it before the doorbell began ringing. This wasn't your normal ringing, however. The person was pushing the button over and over again. It was now well after 5 p.m. and I wasn't aware of anyone visiting that late. I did briefly consider not answering it, but the incessant ringing made me think someone may need help. The woman I encountered on the opposite side of the door had very aggressive body language. I didn't say one word before she tore into me. She demanded to speak to the homeowner. I told her he was out of town on business. It didn't seem wise to let her know when he was to return. She didn't appear to believe me. As she spoke, she grew louder and became visibly angrier. I could feel myself getting increasingly nervous, and I did all I could to convince her. Then, she began cursing at me, calling me all these things and terrible words I'd rather not repeat here. She had convinced herself that I was the homeowner's new girlfriend. I hadn't noticed until just then, but Bart had walked up behind me. As he became more enraged, he grew more aggressive. The scene quickly became a cacophony of yelling and barking. I could feel a panic attack was on the way. I was completely overwhelmed by all of it. Bart's booming bark echoed through the hallway. It looked like he would attack her at any moment, and things would only get worse from here. I'm not sure what I said, but it set the woman off, and she lunged at me. Bart reacted by lunging at her. By some miracle, I was able to get the door closed before anyone was hurt. After that, Bart calmed down a bit. He backed away a few feet and sat down, but his eyes stayed glued to the door. I slid down the door and commenced to suffering one of the worst panic attacks I've ever experienced. The woman continued screaming and pounding on the door, and I was sure that I was dying. To his credit, Bart stayed where he was and did nothing. And minutes passed and I was able to get enough control of myself to call the police. The operator did a fantastic job of talking me down. The police arrived and I made it clear that she attempted to assault me. The officers were understanding and took the woman away with them. I'm not sure if he was formally arrested, however. I was still very shaken. I was a heartbeat away from running back home. In any matter, I had to notify the homeowner of what had happened. He was extremely apologetic and begged me not to leave, but against my better judgment, I agreed to stay. Like I said, I tend toward being a people pleaser. Admittedly, leaving Bart alone after he tried to protect me would have been cruel. We finally agreed that my fee would be doubled. It did feel like extortion, and I knew it may affect my reputation, but I'd already decided this would be my last sitting job, so I accepted. I'd need all the money I could get until I found a new job anyway. The next 2 nights were calm and quiet. Bart stayed by my side the entire time. It made leaving that much harder. The homeowner and I had a brief conversation the morning he returned. He was still very apologetic and explained what may have caused the situation. He and the crazy woman had been dating. but he ended it because of her suspicious and controlling behavior. I didn't inquire any further. I got the impression he was very embarrassed by her. I'd already been paid, so nothing was keeping me around any longer, except for Bart. I bent down and gave my hero a big hug and kiss on the nose. I could already feel the tears welling up. I didn't want to make a scene of myself, so I said goodbye and jogged away to my car. That was the worst and the last of my brief career in house sitting. And I'll miss it for a second, and as for Bart, that's a completely different story. I'm sharing this story specifically as an example of what not to do when you are seeking reliable help. To begin, this was 2018. A well-loved member of our family passed suddenly. An already stressful situation was made worse because of the funeral's distant location. We would have to fly if we wanted to arrive on time. Both my wife and I called multiple boarding businesses, but they were all booked up. We then switched course and sought out house sitters. At some point in the search, a neighbor volunteered their son for the job. The boy had always been respectful and appeared trustworthy on the surface. I had my reservations, but time was running out. It would only be 3 days max. I didn't think he could mess up much in such a short time, and we agreed on a price and the family began packing for the trip. Before we set out, I made sure to leave a note for the boy reminding him of his responsibilities and the location of everything he'd need. I then tried to focus on being there for my family. We arrived in town for the funeral and things went as well as could be expected. My uncle and I had been very close during the course of my growing up. He was the kind of guy you could count on in hard times. Without him, many of us felt somewhat lost. My aunt probably more so than myself, and during our 2.5 days away, I didn't receive any calls or messages. I generally take that as a good sign, but I should have known better. What we would discover upon our return was not only shocking, but an honest-to-goodness lesson on who you should trust. By the time we all arrived back in town, I wanted nothing more than to get home and relax. It was just after 9 a.m. when we pulled into the driveway. Everything looked normal from the outside. It was the inside that drove me over the edge. The moment I stepped inside the door, the acrid, sweet smell of booze and vomit hit me. The kitchen itself was trashed. Dishes were stacked over the edge of the sink. Empty and half-empty liquor bottles covered the counters. I was already starting to get angry. Then I smelled the stale cigarette smoke. I despise nothing more than cigarettes. My grandfather was a chain smoker from the time I can remember, and I had to watch him slowly die because of it. In the living area, I encountered 3 young males sleeping. One was the boy, I say boy although he was nearing 17 at the time, who had left in charge of the home. I shook him awake. Rather than appearing scared, he calmly wished me a good morning. This made me even more livid. Had I been 20 years younger, I may have struck him. I did, however, verbally unload upon him. At first, I demanded an explanation, but quickly realized nothing would justify the state of the house. The other 2 boys were now awake. I yelled for all of them to get out. My wife could tell I was very upset, and she attempted to reel me back a little. In retrospect, I'm now glad she was there. I can't recall a time I've ever been so angry. My temper is not something I'm proud of. Losing control of my emotions in any way is not something I want my children to see. The boys slowly pulled their things together and left, but it wasn't over just yet. My daughter noticed our lab, Roscoe, hadn't greeted us when we arrived. While I made sure the boys left, our kids began searching the house for him. When my daughter went into her room, she not only found Roscoe, but our cat, Midnight, locked in the bedroom with him. It was obvious they had been there for a whole day at least. They had both soiled the carpet more than once. These are both older, housebroken animals who haven't had an accident since they were very young. I could feel myself boiling over. The stupid little boy hadn't even left them with a source of water or food. And after all I'd seen, I had to contact the boy's father. Rather than being apologetic, he tried to stand up for him. He even gave me the "boys will be boys" line. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Weren't there any responsible parents left in the world? I proceeded to go on a tirade which ended with me hanging up. Now I knew where the boy got his careless attitude. My kids dealt with the animals while I began the arduous task of cleaning the house. The angel that she is, my wife told me to go away and relax for a few hours. My pride told me not to, but I knew she was correct. It did take a while, but I was eventually able to cool off enough to fall asleep. When I awoke a few hours later, it was almost as if it had never happened. The stench had all but disappeared. I'm still not sure how she did it, and the house was just as clean as we had left it. Roscoe greeted me the way he always does, and my beautiful wife gave me a cheerful kiss on the lips. In a matter of hours, things were all right in the world again. Yet, I'll never forget. When they say you get what you pay for, it is true 99% of the time. I knew I should have hired a professional. Somehow I let an acquaintance convince me to do him a favor. Not only was I guilted into it, he exploited my lack of time and tendency towards excessive frugality. The deal was just too good to turn down, and you know what they say about that too. The one lesson I'm hoping to teach everyone who reads this: listen to your instincts. They exist for a reason. We, as animals or whatever, learn from experiences and they inform our future actions. And I'll include one more, as it may be more important than the other. Hire professionals whenever possible. They usually know what they're doing, and if they aren't trustworthy, they don't tend to last too long in the business. Don't let your friends or family hook you up with a deal or tell you they're just as good. Learn from my mistake. No one ever regrets hiring the right person for the job. When my husband took early retirement in 2002, we started planning a new chapter of our life together. We both had always loved to travel, so that summer the two of us began planning a vacation. Somehow we stumbled upon house sitting and a whole new world was open to us. On the surface, it sounded amazing. Getting paid to travel and live in a new place each time struck me as heaven. We were both animal lovers too. Taking care of pets seemed to be a big part of the job, so we knew the job had to be made for us. After scouring the internet for related blogs and trading messages with a few people already in the business, we chose to take the plunge. I signed up with a nearby company that places sitters. Our first year was a roller coaster of highs and lows. One or two houses were disgusting. We even had a terrible experience with an angry neighbor. The job I'm about to share was the most traumatic by far, at least for me. I'd be ill for a good part of 2004 and my husband had to stay with me. When I was finally able to go back to work, we began taking on a heavy workload. The following happened just before we took off for the Christmas holiday. Our next placement came up and we did what we usually do: visit the property and meet the pets we'll be taken care of, and everything looked great. The house was beautiful and clean. The dog was friendly and well behaved. We accepted and returned a week later. All was well for the majority of our stay. The house was set up on a hill with a beautiful view. We'd spend our evenings out on the deck watching the sunset. It was one of the best jobs we'd had to date. Then, it all went south in the blink of an eye. One sunny afternoon, we decided to take our furry little host on a walk. The weather had been unseasonably warm, and it seemed the perfect day for it. About 15 minutes into our journey, we came upon a neighborhood at the base of the hill. The houses all looked nice. Some had been decorated for the coming holiday. We had no reason to suspect anything bad would happen. The two of us walked about halfway up the first street, taking in the decorations, and all of a sudden, I hear a cacophony of growling and screeching. I look down and see another dog was attacking our client's dog. I was so shocked it took me a second to grasp the situation. I'd had no indication the dog was around us before that moment. I tried my hardest to pull the poor fellow away from his attacker, but it did no good. My husband had a stick he'd found and began walking with it, a habit I often teased him about. He started swinging it at the attacking dog. After a few good whacks, the dog stopped its assault and turned toward him. He didn't wait to be attacked himself. He struck the dog 5 or 6 times before had enough and ran off. The actual attack only lasted 30 seconds at most, but the damage was severe. Our client's dog had deep gashes and punctures across its back and neck. The amount of blood was horrific. Somehow, I kept my head. I cradled the poor guy in my arms as we fled back toward the house. My husband remained behind me to keep watch for the attacking dog, just in case it returned. By the time we made it back, I was awash in blood. I wasn't sure our poor friend was going to survive much longer. While my husband searched for animal hospitals, I tried to stem the blood with towels. We quickly had an emergency vet on the phone and he told us to hurry in. The clinic was luckily only a few miles away and the poor creature was whisked off to surgery immediately upon arrival. It wasn't until the moment I was able to relax that I realized the bigger problem. There was a dangerous dog running loose around a well-populated area. What if it was rabid or attacked a child? I frantically called 911 and told them of the attack and impending risk. A pair of officers showed up at the clinic around 15 minutes later and took our statements. They assured us that animal control was out searching for the animal at that moment and they'd let us know when they caught him. When the officers had left, I finally tried to clean myself up a little. One of the vet techs was nice enough to give me a scrub top to wear. My shirt went directly into the trash and I washed off as much as possible in the restroom sink. Nothing was left to do but wait after that. Around 5 p.m. we finally got the news. Our client's dog had made it through the surgery. Although very deep, none of the wounds had damaged any major arteries. Barring any post-surgical infection, it looked like he'd survive. My relief was great, but not enough to erase the trauma of the situation. It's taken a good few years for me to be able to trust another person's dog again. Even now I get nervous when I see a dog off-leash. It took 2 days before anyone had any information, and we were finally notified the day before our client was due to return. The dog had been located that same afternoon. Happily, no one else had been attacked. I was kind of sad the dog had been euthanized. Stupid, I know. I guess I'm just a big softie, and I understand, though. A few weeks later, we were happy to learn that the rabies test had come back negative. Our biggest test was the following day. I was sure that this incident would be the undoing of our sitting career. We both expected the homeowner to blame us for what had happened, but he was surprisingly understanding. He was, of course, concerned for his beloved pet, but appeared just as worried about us. The experience turned out to be a positive one. We house sat for him several more times after this, and those occasions were much less eventful than the first. Our furry friend, Jack, made a full recovery and lived another 7 years before passing away in his sleep. Sadly for us, my husband and I have gotten too old to do the house sitting now. We finally called it quits in 2017. During our time in the business, we had many and varied experiences, but the worst by far had to be that day. It may have all worked out in the end, but I'd rather it would have never happened at all, and I'm sure Jack would have agreed. Before I even get to my story, I want to emphasize the point of me writing this. There was more than enough blame for what happened to go around for all of us. The decision was ours to cut corners. Trusting our mother's home to a stranger was stupid. No one denies that. However, the events that unfolded as a result were 100% not our fault. We did everything society tells us to do. The police were called and their job was to protect my sister. They failed in their job. This is on their hands. My number one aim is to impress upon you to know that it's important to fully vet any individual before allowing them to access your home. The following story is written to drive home this very important point. At the end of 2019, just before Christmas in fact, my mother passed away from a long-term illness. As I was already married and set up in a home of my own, my mother left her home to my younger sister, Emily. Emily had been renting up until this time. Her lease had just ended, so she moved in until she was sure of what she was going to do with it. She knew she had my support regardless of her decision. My wife and I threw her a surprise housewarming party for her. At the party, one of Emily's coworkers gave her a kitten as a gift. She had been unable to have any pets in her apartment. It was love at first sight. The weeks after the party were life as usual for all of us. Emily managed to litter train the kitten and all was going well. Just before Valentine's Day, Emily's employer notified her of a business conference she was required to attend. It was part of her job, and this would be her first trip since she had moved into the new house. Normally, this would be simple, but now, with the kitten, things were a tad more complicated. My family was unable to watch the kitten because of my daughter's allergies. Kenneling was briefly considered until the price was found to be too great. Besides, she didn't like the idea of her precious little angel being locked up for 3 days. She chose to search on Craigslist for house sitters. An earlier call to a service proved too high also. She found this young girl, around 19, who claimed to be an independent house sitter. They spoke first on the phone, then met at the house so she could look around. The girl seemed kind and professional. After agreeing on an amount, the deal was set. 2 weeks later, Emily kissed her kitty goodbye and left for her trip. She checked in the first night and all sounded like it was going well. 2 days later, she returned to a nightmare. The clean, beautiful home she had left was now scattered with clothes and dirty dishes. When she confronted the girl got mad and said she wasn't a maid. Things only got worse from there. My sister was horrified to see that the litter box was full and the kitten had already began going on the floor. Certainly not the poor cat's fault, and this infuriated my sister and she refused to pay the girl. An argument broke out and the police were eventually called. They really couldn't do much other than force the girl to leave the property, but the girl was furious. She vowed she'd get back at my sister as she left. This was all said in front of the police, but they obviously didn't take the threat seriously. The officer went on their way and my sister began cleaning up the mess inside. A few days passed and Emily tried to put the experience behind her. That Friday, soon after returning from work, a man rang the doorbell and asked for her. She identified herself and the man began demanding the money owed to the young girl. My sister calmly explained the situation, but he only grew more aggressive. Although she was now terrified, she held her ground and refused. This was when the man backhanded her. She fell back and hit her head on the floor. Unfortunately, he wasn't done. He approached her and demanded the money again. My sister, who was clearly concussed, didn't answer, so he punched her unconscious. Apparently, while she was out, he entered the house and stole all the cash from her purse. By the time she had awakened, he was gone. It took her several minutes to crawl to her phone and call 911. They arrived soon after and she was rushed to the hospital. I'm happy to say that there's no long-term physical injuries, but mentally, Emily was a mess. And still is, honestly. To be frank, had I known the identity of the man and his location, I would have killed him. Fortunately, I regained my senses and agreed to leave it in the authorities' hands, despite their inability to prevent it. The responsible parties were found and arrested within a couple of days. It wasn't some great mystery after all. The man who assaulted Emily was an ex-boyfriend of the young girl. She had promised him half of the money to retrieve it. The young girl claimed she never intended anyone to be hurt, but her threat in front of witnesses, cops at that, sealed her fate. She managed to get away with probation because she had no priors. Her ex, on the other hand, had a long record. He was given 3 years. But once the COVID crisis began, he was released early. The entire family was less than happy to hear of the lenient sentences, but criminals getting off easy is nothing new under the sun these days. In the months since the attack, everyone has done their most to be there for Emily. Her recovery is going well, and she seems to be responding to therapy. The lockdowns have proved a blessing for her. She's been able to heal at a much slower and calm pace. Until restrictions are lifted completely, she'd been approved to work from home. Her little furry friend has served as a priceless companion for her during this terrible time. Although some may say he was the cause of this whole awful mess, I'm glad he's been around to keep her company. My story takes place in 2014. I was 2 years out of college and couldn't keep a job to save my life. My attitude wouldn't change until much later. Anyhow, I got connected with a house-sitting agency. The job itself was cool, but the woman running the place was just a jerk to everyone. You may be seeing a pattern here, but I promise you, in this case, I wasn't the actual problem. Well, I put up with her terrible attitude for as long as possible. Nevertheless, the day came when I gave her a piece of my mind. I've gotten a whopping 3 months of experience in the business at this point. And somewhere in my crazy mind, I got the idea I knew the business better than her, and I decided to go independent. I put up a post selling my skills on a few sites. Nothing came out of it at first, but I got my first call on that following Monday. This job unfortunately fell through at the last minute. I was back at the beginning. It took 6 more days before another offer came through, and this was from a family just 10 miles from me. They were planning a vacation and needed someone to take care of their dog. The father with whom I spoke sounded very nice. We made an appointment for the following day for me to come around. The next day, I dressed in my best outfit and drove out to meet them. The house was set off by itself on 4 acres near the county line, a mostly rural area. I'd sat for another family nearby, so I had no reason to be suspicious. As I pulled up to the house, I was a little disappointed by the state of the place. Despite being a large house, it was somewhat run down. Also, the family's 2 cars were at least 10 years old and a little beat up. I didn't want to be a snob, but I had a feeling the inside wouldn't be much better. The idea of spending 3 nights there sounded a lot less appealing now. None of this mattered, though. I had made an appointment and I was going to keep it. Besides, nothing said I had to take the job if I didn't want it. With all this in mind, I rang the bell and put on my happiest face. The door was answered by a well-dressed young man who identified himself as the father. It did strike me as odd that a man would dress so neatly but stop at his shoes, a pair of old, raggedy running shoes, but I assumed he had a reason and put it out of my mind. He invited me in and we sat together in the kitchen. I was relieved to see that the interior was in better shape, but I did notice a slight musty smell. The job was looking a bit of a mixed bag. I was leaning toward turning it down, but what came in the next half hour or so would determine my final decision. While we waited for his wife to join us, the man and I made small talk. I was told she was putting the kids down for a nap and would be just a moment. I could hear movement down the hall. There was no indication that he was lying. However, as the seconds passed, small little things began to bother me. For starters, there was no sign any pets or children lived there. No toys laying around, no sippy cups, no water bowls or dog beds. The closer I looked, the less it looked like anyone lived there at all. Yet, it was fully furnished, but no dishes sat on the counters or appliances ran in the background. I began to feel a slight unease. Something was telling me to get out. And while this was all going on inside my head, the father was talking. He was telling a story and using his hands a lot. And this was when I noticed his fingernails. Why would a man who seemed to care so much about his appearance have such dirty fingernails? Strike 2. This is a mid-level office worker if I had to guess. He would certainly not be doing manual labor. Even if he had a hobby like woodworking, wouldn't he bother to at least clean under his nails? I'm well aware of how stupid this all sounds, but put it together, with all the other things I've noticed, my instincts were telling me to leave. I knew if something was wrong, I needed to play it cool. If not, I didn't want to cause a scene. No sense in destroying a business before I even got it off the ground. As calmly as I could, I said I had forgotten something in my car. I'd go out and grab it, then return in just a moment. I smiled and stood up. As I turned to walk away, the man grabbed my wrist and held me. Strike 3. This was all the proof I needed. My heart began to pound. He looked at me and spoke through gritted teeth. "You're not going anywhere, honey." All the kindness had left his voice. The true face now stared coldly back at me. Panic surged through every inch of my body. I knew I wasn't going to leave this place the same person I was when I entered. That is, if I ever left at all. I noticed his eyes jumping back and forth from me to the hall. He appeared nervous. Perhaps his partner or partners were being detained by something. All I knew was that I had to get away before they arrived. I waited until he looked toward the hall again and took my chance. I yanked my arm away as hard as I could. His temporary lack of focus gave me just enough advantage to break free. I ran straight for the front door. I had wisely worn flats instead of my usual heels. This decision was the thing that allowed me to get away. Any woman reading this knows why. And no sooner had I broken free, my captor yells out to his accomplices. Why he hadn't called to them until now still eludes me. Not bothering to lock my car door was another choice I'd made that would ultimately benefit me. The distance, although just a few feet from the door to my car, seemed like miles. I made it into my car and was able to lock the door before they managed to catch me. It wasn't until I was in the midst of juggling with my keys that I saw the second of the men. While I struggled to get my car started, my now two assailants banged on the car and pulled at the door handle. The second man was much larger than the other. There was no way I would have gotten away from him. I did finally get the car going and sped away from the property. It was the first time I can recall taking a breath in the preceding 5 minutes. As I sped down the highway, I called 911 to report my near abduction. I wasn't sure if my attackers were still pursuing me or not. Instead of heading home, I made for the nearest police station. I didn't dare let my guard down until I was safely inside the building and speaking to an officer. I quickly repeated my incident to the cop. He filed a report while we waited to hear from the patrol cars that had been sent to the house. It wasn't a shock to hear that the men had fled. What did shock me was what the officers discovered in the master bedroom. The report stated the following, but I will be paraphrasing. When Officers White and Dawson reached the largest bedroom of the home, they discovered it had been stripped bare of furniture. In place of the furniture, the walls and floors had been covered in multiple layers of what looked to be contractor's plastic sheeting. What purpose the assailants had in mind for the room can only be guessed at this time. I still tear up at the thought of what awaited me in that room. I've never been a religious person, but I can't help but feel someone or something was watching out for me that day. I wish I could say that my would-be attackers were caught and are now doing life in prison, but the truth is, they remain unidentified to this day. The house they had used turned out to be uninhabited. After the death of the owner, the family had let it lay fallow. No further hints were needed. I decided the independent house-sitting business wasn't for me. I continued to bounce between jobs until I got on with a small printing shop. The family that runs the place are the kindest folks I've ever met, and they are far more forgiving of my little quirks than my previous employers. I'm coming up on my 4th year with them, and I hope I'll be there until my retirement. Now that I'm 7 years older and more mature, I've learned just how dangerous the world can be. In my early 20s, I wouldn't have thought twice about traveling to strange places alone. In retrospect, my overconfidence in my ability to protect myself is what led me to that house, and no one could have convinced me I was wrong. Since that day, I've become much more vigilant about my safety. I don't go anywhere without crossing all my T's and dotting my I's. By far, the most important thing I do is listen to my instincts. They are what saved me that day. And don't worry about offending someone if you feel you may be in danger. We have these senses for a reason. Please, pay them close attention and be careful, ladies. Goodbye, and stay safe. This took place in mid-2008. I'd been out of school for over a year. The economic downturn was just beginning to affect the job market, and a lack of any stable financial prospects was causing me to fear for my future. Not to mention my living arrangements. I was almost 26 and had yet to achieve any of my goals. Unlike me, all my friends had careers and were on the path of starting families. I didn't even have a boyfriend. Since money-making opportunities were thin on the ground, I accepted a job house-sitting for a rich couple in the city. Other than watering their plants, there was no real reason for me to be there. The building had a concierge desk that required any visitors to sign in and a security guard. My presence made no sense to me, but they were offering actual money, so I didn't care much. The agreement was for 7 days, Friday to Friday. When I signed in that first evening, everything had the appearance of calm and stability. The guard on duty accompanied me on the 15th-floor elevator journey to the apartment. During the course of our ride, he introduced himself and we made small talk. Dell was a tall, oddly thin young man with a patchy mustache and short, slick-back hair. He was nice enough, but I got the feeling that he was trying to impress me. More than once, he mentioned how much importance his position afforded him. I must admit his attempt at flirting did flatter me a bit. Even if I wasn't attracted to him, it was nice to know someone may have been interested. When we arrived at our destination, Dell let me in. We said our goodbyes, and I assumed I'd probably never see him again. After I had a quick look around the apartment, I decided to have a little snack before bed. I noticed a note from the owners on the table. It was just your basic, make yourself at home and enjoy your stay. I took them up on their offer and raided the fridge. Once I was stuffed full of expensive deli meats, I got the urge to sample an open bottle of wine. I didn't dare take more than a few swallows worth, just in case I was taking their invitation a tad too literally. I can't say it was any more impressive than the cheap stuff I drank, but hey, when in Rome. Having made my mark on my new domain, I cleaned up my mess and headed for bed. I did very little for the next 2 days. Other than eat and sleep, I spent most of my waking hours watching Netflix on my client's massive TV. Dell came by on my second evening to give me a temporary card key. We spoke for a few minutes. I think he tried to ask me out at one point, but his wording left things a tad ambiguous. I erred on the safe side and played dumb. He eventually ran out of things to say, and I used the opportunity to slip away. Things were quiet after that. By Monday, I was becoming stir-crazy. Just after lunch, I stepped out for some fresh air. During my walk, I grabbed a coffee and flipped through some magazines, but soon, Netflix began calling and I returned to the building. I ran into Dell and he struck up a conversation. I listened kindly until I saw my chance and bid him a good day and proceeded to the elevator. As the doors closed, I noticed he'd already began talking to a parcel delivery guy at the desk. You could see the annoyance on the guy's face. I couldn't help but chuckle. He wasn't really a bad guy, he just tried too hard. Nothing else of interest would occur until the wee hours of Thursday morning. I had turned in around 12:30 and was deep asleep when a loud banging shook me awake. Disoriented, I wasn't sure what was happening. I sat up and listened, and almost immediately it restarted. Now I could tell it was coming from the front door, and a sick feeling of fear began growing in the pit of my stomach. It began again, but now I could hear a person yelling. I timidly walked up to the door and looked out the peephole, and there stood Dell, looking intently at the hole. My fear instantly switched into anger. This was going too far. I prepared to curse him out, but before the words could leave my mouth, something stopped me. There was something strange about his expression. I looked out again. He now appeared to be in a full panic. He ran across the hall and banged on another door, then returned. I figured I should see what the matter was, so I yanked the door open, fully prepared to give him a butt chewing if necessary. Dell began ranting about something, and I stepped out into the hall and realized what he was so worked up about. The smell of smoke filled the hall, and a light gray cloud was turning the corner towards us about 50 feet away. I could now hear the faint sound of the smoke alarms coming from the floors below, but wondered why there was none going off on ours. All the anger I'd been feeling just a moment before disappeared into the smoke. Without a second thought, I grabbed Dell's outstretched hand and we ran for the stairs. The smoke got less and less as we descended, and we must have made it down in record time. Several of the residents were assembled in the lobby, and they looked around cluelessly. But Dell sprang into action, and together, we started to lead everyone out into the street. The firemen were already beginning to arrive. They were fortunately able to put the fire out within the hour, and nobody suffered any more than mild smoke inhalation and a few minor burns. Things began to wind down around dawn, and most everyone had been checked out, and the last few residents were making arrangements for temporary housing. My opinion of Dell had changed drastically over the last few hours. His bravery and leadership impressed me greatly, honestly, and that's why when he asked me to join for breakfast, I gladly agreed. After a quick stop at my place to change into something a tad more public, we had a wonderful meal. I would get to see a whole new side of him. It turned out he was an amazing artist. The security job was just temporary until he could get on into the entertainment industry. And as we went our separate ways that afternoon, I made an unexpected decision. I wanted to see Dell again. And I did. For the next 7.5 months, we continued dating. It was never super serious. We both knew his future lay in California. And when the call finally came, he and I said our goodbyes and he boarded a flight to a better life. We do still speak from time to time, but We've both moved on with our lives, and I doubt our partners would approve of anything more. I'll go ahead and end my story here. There have been a few other exciting, scary incidents in my life, and I may post here again in the future when I have the time. Probably the most important lesson I've taken away from this whole incident is to avoid making split-second decisions about someone you've just met. Their ways may be strange, even occasionally annoying, but you should give them a chance. Heroes can appear at the most unexpected times, and heroism in the most unexpected of people. Dell is one of those people, and just for that, I feel blessed to have known him. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long, big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, schnoozeberries taste like schnoozeberries.